Dr. Cheryl Fuller, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you.
Well, it's really good to have you on the show. And you've written a very penetrating book about fat shaming. And it's titled The Fat Lady Sings. And so that's what I'm going to be asking you about quite a bit.
Great.
And you're very upfront in your book about it being rooted in and driven by your own personal experience.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe you can take us through the outline of your personal struggle with being fat. I mean, in a way, the whole book is about that.
Sure.
But, you know, let's start with, when did it begin for you, this awareness of being fat?
When I was a little girl. When I was really little, till I was about 4.5, I was tiny. And I had my tonsils taken out. And I distinctly remember, the one thing I remember is sitting in the doctor's office afterwards with a checkup and him saying to my mother, "You watch, she'll eat you out of house and home." And the way
Wow.
4-year-olds,
Yeah.
the way 4-year-olds think, that seemed like a very odd thing. How was I going to do that? By the time I was 5, one of my great uncles, every time we were staying with my grandmother, and every time he came over to her house, he would come in and he would sing that dreadful old song that Arthur Godfrey sang, "I don't want her, you can have her, she's too fat for me."
Oh, yeah, I do
And I
remember
would
that.
hide behind the chair.
Oh.
And so I was aware then.
At 5?
At 5,
Wow.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And in one of your chapters, you describe let's move it ahead a little on the
Sure.
timeline. Let's talk about grade school and then high school and then college. And
Oh, goodness. It wasn't, in some ways, I think it was easier being a fat kid then than it is now, because the messages in the culture are so ever present, coming from all directions. But it's never been easy. And, I can remember being weighed in school, like in 3rd grade, and it's like,
That's
oh,
right. I forgot. They used to
oh,
weigh us.
horrible. Yeah. And it was never confidential, so everybody always knew.
You were standing in line, right? Probably.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And just feeling like, and I was not remarkably fat, which is true for a lot of people that get kids that get called fat. Like what gets called to mind for people often is a really fat kid. Well, I wasn't a really fat kid. I was chubby, I suppose.
Right.
But it doesn't make any difference. And by the time, you get to junior high and it's all about who's pretty, who's not, and you become aware of the standard for what's okay and what isn't. I was very aware, and certainly in high school I was. But I think the fact that I could compensate by being really smart helped a lot.
Yeah.
And plus my dad was in the Army then, so we moved every 2 to 4 years. So I didn't have the experience of a long history with anybody. And every time you move, when you're an Army kid, you figure you can be a different person, which of course is absurd, but it's a comforting thought that this time I'll know how to do it better. So I never was ostracized. I always had friends, but I didn't date until I was in college. So, it was those kinds of things. And the kinds of things people would say, so which is just everybody I know who has been fat has had those experiences, so it's pretty commonplace.
Sure. In fact, one of the things that you speak quite a bit about in the book are the cultural messages about being fat, and there's no way you can avoid being exposed to those.
No, it's impossible.
Yeah, what are the cultural messages? Give us examples of that.
The average American woman today is a size 14 or above. Two-thirds of American women are above a size 14. But when you look at films or watch television or in advertising, you don't see women that size.
Yeah, I sometimes have some awareness of this when I'm in a public place like a mall or something, or sitting at a cafe and watching people walk by.
Mm-hmm.
And hardly anybody that you see fits the ideal in our culture of body size.
Right.
All kinds of shapes and sizes, and many of them larger than the cultural ideal.
Right. There aren't any fat dolls. It's like if you're a girl and you learn, I remember my daughter wanted a Barbie doll, and I was adamant and saying, no, nobody can't have a Barbie doll because, it's spouting feminist stuff. And my daughter telling me at age 5, but Mom, she's just a doll. And she was right.
Yeah.
And part of the entertainment value of a Barbie for 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds is dressing and undressing them and trying out different ways to look. Well, you can't, a fat kid, there isn't a fat Barbie. So even in playing with a doll, you're playing with somebody who doesn't look like you will ever look, most likely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's
well, you have hopes at a certain
sure,
for a
you
long
wish
time
you will.
have hopes that you are.
You want to believe you will,
Yeah.
but it doesn't happen for most of us. And even when Michelle Obama started her initiative on healthy kids, although it really was initially it was pegged as against childhood obesity, which anyway, the incidence of eating disorders in girls as young as 8 and 9 went way up because they started worrying about what they were eating. An 8 or 9-year-old child shouldn't be worried about what they eat, or how they look. But so the effects come quite rapidly. The sizing and clothing. If 2/3 of American women wear over a size 14, why is anything a size 16 and above called a plus size? Plus what? And when I was growing up, when I was a young woman, there was no size 0. There is now. Why aren't there minus sizes? I mean, if you're going to go plus and minus, you should go either side of the norm, right?
Yeah.
They don't. So
I've got granddaughters, and they're very much into the American Girl
dolls, right?
Dolls. Having been to New York, having been to the big store that they have there, do they? I know they've got African American dolls now, and maybe a couple of other ethnic variations. Are there fat girl dolls?
No, but the nice thing about American Girl dolls is they're not teenagers; they're younger girls. So there's not there's not so much emphasis on the shape of the doll. So she looks like an average little girl, 7, 8-year-old. So it becomes an issue when you get into the fashion dolls.
Yeah. Now, one of the concepts that runs through the book is the notion of the cultural complex.
Yes.
And you talk about the war on obesity as an example of a cultural complex. So first, tell us what a cultural complex is, which I'm running into that concept in another upcoming interview with somebody else on a totally different area. So what is a cultural complex? And then tell us about the war on obesity and how that's an example of that.
Well, Singer and Kimball, who are 2 Jungians, wrote a book, it must be about almost 10 years ago now, called The Cultural Complex, which is a fascinating idea, where they took the notion of a complex, which is a feeling tone collection of ideas. The best example I know is from the old sitcom Mad About You, when the wife's parents have been visiting and they drive her crazy and they leave. And she says to her husband, "Why do they push my buttons so?" And he says, "Because they installed them." So a culture, a complex is, when you push it, it evokes an emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
And they extend this into the culture. So when you, certainly one complex very much around right now is, and has been since 2001, is about Muslims and Islamophobia, this terrible fear in some sectors of the culture about Muslims, which it's a complex. It's not based on any real experience, and it's very emotional. It's kind of unreasoning, and it's automatic.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the same fat. I don't think anybody else has written about fat complex, but I see the war on obesity as an example of a cultural complex, where it's aimed at a group, and that group serves as a scapegoat for a variety of other fears and issues, and it's sort of unquestioned until
Yeah.
somebody raises it as an issue. It just passes without notice. So
Yeah.
everybody assumes that, of course, we have to have a war on obesity because it's terrible, 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 terrible. And so it permeates everything. It's in the media. It's in health messaging. It's in how people of different weights are portrayed. It's pervasive. And
Now, some people are probably going to say, well, yeah, war on obesity, that makes sense because it's a health issue. And so it's an issue that's been kind of medicalized.
Very much.
Talk about that. So give us your challenge to that notion.
Well, you can't tell anything about somebody's health by looking at them.
We
So
have the impression that fat people will not live as long, that they'll have
I'm
a heart
71.
attack.
I'm 71 and I'm still here.
You look like you're well and kicking here.
And I had, my father had 3 sisters, all of whom were fat. One of them was 95 when she died. And I had a doctor once tell me that wasn't possible, that she lived to be 95. And I offered to show him the obituary. He didn't take kindly to that.
Yeah.
But the fact is, of course, there are some fat people who have health issues. There are plenty of slender people with health issues.
Mm-hmm.
There are illnesses that are correlated with height, but we don't suggest that parents keep their children shorter in order to avoid those illnesses. Male pattern baldness is associated with an increased risk of heart disease. Well, we don't suggest hair transplants to avoid the risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Redheads are subject to some illnesses at a higher rate than other people, but we don't suggest that dyeing their hair will change the risk.
Yeah.
We recognize in all of those cases that there is a third factor involved that we're not seeing directly that causes that contributes, like, for example, to male pattern baldness and to a risk of cardiovascular illness.
Yeah.
So there's another variable. And the same is true with weight. So I talked to somebody just the other day whose doctor had told him if he didn't lose weight, he would get diabetes. Now, he's not showing any signs of diabetes. You don't have to be fat to develop type 2 diabetes. There are slender type 2 diabetics. Average weight type.
Okay.
Tom Hanks has type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
I don't think people
He's
would call
slender.
him fat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but that association has been drilled in. And I've often wondered if it's, if they screened everybody for diabetes like they do fat people, if they might not find the incidences would change. But we get screened for things that is believed we are likely to develop.
Mm-hmm. So even in the medical realm, we have this sort of unquestioned
mm-hmm.
assumptions and almost like urban myths,
Yes.
you know?
Yes, there have been large-scale studies in the Rudd Center, which is now at the University of Connecticut. The Rudd Center has done studies, they've been done in the UK and in France as well, that show anti-fat bias is quite strong in the medical community,
Yeah,
believing
you
that
get
fat
some
people are
horrifying
lazy.
examples in the
Yeah.
book, yeah, of just real blindness. And another term that you introduced that in this context is the idea of moral panic.
Yes. That this is something that, you know, it's not, it, the definition, of course, is going to escape me right now, but it's a moral panic brings into the issue an additional element of
Emotion, right? Of
emotion. Yeah,
strong
this is
emotion.
something
But
that
I think of homosexuality as,
exact
you
moral
know,
panic. Yeah.
yeah, a homosexual panic. It's so threatening that we have to go beat these people up.
Right, and there's something the qualities of moral panic about fatness is that somehow we are a threat to, you know, life as we know it somehow.
Yeah, yeah. And
Um,
and in your book you give lots of examples. I mean,
Absolutely.
everybody who, you know, their fat jokes, you know, which for a long time were considered okay. I think
They
now
still are.
there still are. I'm sure in many corridors, hopefully, you know, yeah. And it's just, it's funny. There's a sort of taken for grantedness,
Mhm.
right? But that strangely is coming from a bit of, as you say, moral panic. Thank God that's not me. And
Yes.
and
Yeah.
I've been,
And it it's blamed on the fat person. The fat person is deemed responsible for
yes,
his or her body size, and and for everything that flows from that. So airlines are, nobody likes flying unless you can fly first class, and that's not a privilege I've had. But you know, the airlines, in an effort to increase their profits, have made seats narrower and narrower and narrower. But it's so when somebody gets on a plane and they see they're seated next to a fat person, it's the fat person they're angry with, not
mhm,
not the airline. Which,
mhm.
even if you're an average sized person, you're going to be squeezed because they don't accommodate you.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's good to be aware of, because I could, it's just natural to go to that place of, oh my God, this fat person is sitting next to me.
But the tall person who's sitting behind you, whose legs are bumping your seat, you don't see them as responsible for their bodies that are causing you discomfort. See,
Yeah.
it's okay to be really tall.
Yeah, one thing that you write in the book that I really liked, you wrote, and I quote, "Fat people become the repository for the sins of the culture as a whole. Fat people are the quotes sin eaters."
Yes. Yeah. When I wanted to think about uh, what this, because I'm a Jungian, we have to think about meaning. And what does it mean? What is all of this emphasis on fatness about? And the scapegoat, the notion of a scapegoat comes from ancient Judaism, when there were two goats and one was sacrificed and the other became sort of the carrier of the sins of the group and was sent into the wilderness to carry the sins away. And in a way, that's certainly what happens with fat people. So we live in a time period now where excess is still very much, I mean, look at our president's home or where he chooses to be. It's excessive. And
Yeah,
although, and the war on obesity is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it coincides with a time when when the threat of terrorism rose, so you've got people afraid that they're going to lose control. And so everything has to be controlled because you can't control terrorism, but you can look at fat people and tell them they ought to control their weight. If I can control my weight, why can't you? You have greed, the age of, I talk about the McMansion and SUVs. Where I live, you can maybe make an argument that it's helpful to have an SUV but the roads are plowed in the winter, and people who have cars rather than big SUVs get around just fine. But you look at the number of people who have large SUVs or large pickup trucks or
I don't feel safe on the road because I don't have one of those.
Exactly.
And all these big things all around me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that so that there's excess. So where do you look to place the guilt or the shame of excess? If you're not going to own it yourself, you're going to look to whoever you see as exemplifying.
Part of the moral judgment
yes.
is the notion that, well, you could control this, but you're just being lazy or something,
right?
Or irresponsible, or and yet we should know just by the sheer numbers of people who, as you pointed out, who are overweight, that is not controllable.
No. Well, you can
Or
modify up to no, not very much.
Yeah.
It's every method of weight loss is successful only up to a point, even bariatric surgery. In most instances, when you look 5 years out, you start to see a regain. My husband and I have a friend who had bariatric surgery, lost 100 pounds, and regained all of it.
Wow.
And when you think about that, you think about how horrifying that is, because her gut is permanently altered. So she still has the complex issues involved with nutrition and everything, and she regained the weight. It's terrible. And if you look if you look carefully at studies, excuse me, of weight loss on one diet or another, they never go more than 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to see the weight regain at about the 2-year mark, even people who are really vigilant. And by 5 years out, the vast majority of people, somewhere between 95 and 98% of people who lost more than 10% of their starting weight have regained it, and often more.
It occurs to me that another indicator of moral panic and cultural, what do we call it? Cultural complex is the endless stream of weight loss and diet books, right?
Oh yeah.
That's always every year. You'd think it would be solved by now because a book came out that said, hey, lose weight quick and easy. Well, there are a ton of those books year after year after year after year. And somehow we at large don't take in the message of, this stuff must not work.
Well, right. And they find a willing market in people with whatever amount of weight they think they have to lose, who are willing to do almost anything to do that in order to feel like they're right.
So in a way, it's kind of exploitative when you think about it.
Yeah, it's a great market.
They are capitalizing on people's fears and pain spot.
Years ago, when there was an article in on a business magazine, right after Nutrisystem had started, and it was started by the owner of the Philadelphia 76ers, and he was looking to branch out and have other businesses, and so he thought about what he could do that would have guaranteed repeat business, and he noticed his mother was always on a diet. She'd lose weight, she'd regain it, she'd lose weight, and so it wasn't his son just magnanimous desire to help fat people that he started that business. It was because it had a guaranteed repeat business.
Yeah. Yeah. About like being a undertaker,
Yeah.
unlimited
Yeah.
business.
Well, and you know, there's nothing wrong with most of those programs, except that you're pushing up against biology, and it, you know, most of them do encourage you to eat in a nutritionally sound way. There are certainly exceptions to that, but that's not the issue. You know, it's the issue is what your body's going to do to defend the weight, and nobody wants to tell you that.
Yeah, yeah. And not only are you pushing against your own biology, but you're pushing against these very powerful cultural messages that are saying, eat, eat, buy, eat,
Well,
eat a lot. And I see people walking around the mall or in their car and they're sucking on some high fructose thing. So it's kind of contradictory. We're getting two different kinds of message. Well,
oh yeah.
conflicting messages.
There was a study that was just done. I just saw a reference to it. In looking at, for example, you know, again, coming back to the type 2 diabetes thing, that members of discriminated groups, no matter what the discrimination is about, whether it's race or religion,
Mm-hmm.
have a higher incidence of type 2 diabetes than people not in a discriminated group. So it's clear that weight is not the determining factor in whether or not you develop diabetes. Just today, I saw. I posted to Facebook a report of a study done on who eats fast food, because the belief is it's fat people and poor people. But in fact, there's no difference across socioeconomic groups
Uh-huh.
who eats fast food. There's no difference.
Uh-huh. You talk about the experience of being fat as an
Mm-hmm.
ongoing trauma.
It is. It's like there's a woman who, an Australian sociologist who's fat and who's written a lot about weight, Samantha Murray. And I was reading articles by her, and there was one that in which she's at a conference, and she's hearing about a study done with some young men and fat women, and how that sometimes young men will exploit fat women, seeing them as an easy target sexually. And as she was listening, she sort of separated from herself, because it was so painful to hear, and she could remember feeling that. So it's a perfect example of dissociating.
Mm-hmm.
And as I thought about that, you know, when you split from your body in order to tolerate a situation, and fat people do that all the time. You can't go out in public if you're fat without somehow, unless you're one of those fortunate few who have become at home in your body. You are an object of scrutiny, of derision, of judgment, and that's painful. So you split from it. It's not, and you can, as I report, I did for years. I thought if I was in a room, no one would know I was there unless I spoke, as if I had pixie dust surrounding me or something, which is patently absurd.
Yeah.
But it's the way that I could manage going about in the world, speaking in front of groups, things like that.
Well, because of that hyper awareness of being fat, what were some of the things that you did to try to become a non-fat person over the course of your life?
I did every diet program that there was. I did them all repeatedly. And the thing is, when you're on a diet, you know, you think about food constantly. You get up in the morning thinking about what you can eat, what you can't eat. You're planning dinner before you've gotten through lunch. You go to bed at night reviewing, you know, the day, and promising yourself you'll be better tomorrow. All of it. It's terrible. And after after I had my first child, and I tried to lose weight, and I was breastfeeding and walking every day carrying the baby, and I didn't. I had enough. I just decided I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah.
It's not doing this
Yeah,
anymore.
with the dieting. But you also, another one of the things that you did to try to become a non-fat person was go into therapy.
Well,
Various
no, I
therapies, right?
never went into therapy to try to become not fat.
Oh,
I went
okay.
to therapy for other things, and the therapist, more than one in my lifetime, would say something like, "Well, don't you think it would be better if you lost some weight?" I had a very difficult second pregnancy, and I was quite depressed afterwards. And I went to see a therapist, and it was clear my marriage was not going well, and I was visibly depressed, and all she wanted to talk about was my weight.
Mm-hmm.
So I left. Of course.
Yeah, but you ran into a similar phenomenon more than once, right?
Yeah, every
Therapist.
time. Every
Yeah.
time. Um, it's commonplace. And we therapists don't know diddly squat about how people can or would lose weight. That's way outside our bailiwick.
Mm-hmm. Somehow we think we can,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Because, well, I was in a writing program that's called New Directions in Writing. And it's for people interested in writing from a psychological point of view. And in the writing group, which was run by an analyst and a writer, we're presenting the first part of the book. And in it, I talk about the fact that I've never been a compulsive eater, really. I've never binged and done those things. And she says, the woman analyst who was running the group says, could you tell us exactly what you eat, how you eat? and I said, actually, I'm not going to do that because you're proving my point. You assume that I eat differently from the way you do, and that if I ate the way you do and exercised the way you do, I would look like you, because you're assuming this is because of things I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, yeah. So again, that's pointing to a possible moral weakness on your part.
Right. And she was well intentioned. I was
Yeah,
grateful for her for doing that. She, for one thing, provided me with an example,
yeah,
but that it proved my point
yeah.
that's what happens. And I also talk about privilege. We talk about white privilege. There's male privilege. There's also thin privilege. If weight's not a big issue for you, or your weight, cycles through 10 or 15 pounds, but you don't fret about it, you can buy your clothes anywhere and all of that, you're pretty much completely unaware
Mm-hmm.
of what somebody who is fat deals with. And you don't understand that being slender actually conveys upon you privilege. Most of the books written.
And you may feel like you have moral superiority
Oh,
because
absolutely.
you're thin, right?
Absolutely. And
As if you did it by your own willpower or something.
well, yeah.
You're
And if
just
I
kind of
only behave
born that
properly,
way. Yeah.
yeah, if I behaved properly, I would be slender too. The fact is that most of the books, even really good ones about fat, even about fat activism, have been written by slender people, because fat people aren't considered to be credible reporters of their own experience. It's like, oh, well, she's in denial.
Huh.
Um, the back when I was first in graduate school, and behaviorism was first really coming to the fore clinically. It's like we didn't trust self-report. So fat people are entirely unreliable on self-report. They'll believe that you lie about what you eat, that you can't possibly be telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so and privilege is unconscious. You're not aware that you have that privilege.
Right.
There's no point in being in someone like me getting angry with somebody who has thin privilege. It's unconscious, but it's important that I find ways to talk about it so that you can become aware of your privilege.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that reading your book certainly was a consciousness raising experience for me.
Good.
And I guarantee it will be for anybody who reads
Good.
the book. Yeah. Yeah. It definitely sensitized me to all sorts of unconscious biases and so on. And so it's really valuable in that way. You talk about the term obese
Mm-hmm.
or obesity in relation to fat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of an everyday term that we think of, that it's a useful term, but you
Medical.
contend against that idea.
Well, there's been more than one study looking at that when you look at the effect of the term obese, see, people think that if I call somebody obese, that it's destigmatizing because nobody wants to say fat.
Mm.
As if fat is not. Cameron Manheim famously said, "Fat is not a 4-letter word," and it's not. So it's just a descriptor. I
think people think that it's precise, that obese it means you're over a certain weight.
And it's not precise at all. And it's medicalizing. So it takes, the word obese enhances anti-fat bias. It doesn't diminish it. There have been good studies showing that. Look at, we don't, when somebody's tall, we don't call basketball players over tall. They're tall.
Yeah.
But so why do we have the term overweight? Over what weight? What does that mean? And if you start looking into what obese means, you begin to see it's very fuzzy. You say, but well, we can tell by looking at people. No, you can't, because there are people who are classified as obese because of the use of body mass index, which has its own problems, who you would look at and say, oh, she's a normal person. But by classification, they would be obese. So it's problematic, and it's problematic that obese by itself, being fat by itself, became classified as a disease by the AMA a couple of years ago, because not all fat people have health issues. So why classify somebody who's basically healthy as not healthy?
Yeah, isn't it the case that in some other cultures and in other times, being fat was prized? Could be a sign of affluence, for example?
At the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, oh my God, I've just lost her last name. Lillian, the American Beauty Rose was named after her anyway, and she weighed 200 pounds. If you look at photos of Marilyn Monroe, by today's standards, she's heavy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In certain African cultures, it's fat women are prized. In Samoa, it was not a problem until American television came there. Then you start seeing eating disorders in girls rising because they're trying to look like American girls.
Yeah.
So
I'm blocking on the famous painter who paints, beautiful fat women reclining on couches.
Oh yeah, and I lost him
I
too.
knew it yesterday.
The joy of age.
Yeah, I knew
There's a
it yesterday.
sculptor, a Colombian painter and sculptor whose wife was fat, and he did wonderful paintings of fat people, and he's not fat, and they have these wonderful expressions. And I was in New York once when he did massive bronzes as well, and some of them were on the median down Park Avenue, and this massive woman in bronze. It was wonderful.
Rubens.
Yes,
We
Rubens.
refer
But
to
I mean, we have
a woman
contemporary
being
artists doing that.
Rubenesque.
Yes,
Right?
we
Yeah.
have contemporary artists as well. So it's definitely, follows fashion. It wasn't fashionable to be really thin until Twiggy came in the 60s, but it's cyclical, because in the 20s, the very slender body was fashionable because it fit the clothing style, so it varies all over the place. But
another concept that you wield is the concept of social contagion in relation to fat.
Can you remember when that came out several years ago, where they were alleging that if you're that if you're fat, your friends and neighbors would be more likely to be fat also? It was a crazy idea.
I don't remember that.
Well, it was debunked immediately, but didn't gain traction in in terms of being reported. The original study claiming this social contagion got wide coverage in magazines and television news and newspapers. The studies that debunked that didn't get coverage for a very long time, couldn't even get published for several years, because this notion that, well, fat people are a danger not only to themselves but to everybody else, because they'll make everybody get fat. That feeds the narrative about how we are a hazard.
Uh-huh.
It's not the social contagion theory is just bunk.
Yeah. Okay. So being fat was something that you worked on in psychotherapy, right?
Absolutely.
Particularly with some Jungians.
Yeah. Well, I have in my in my current analysis. I'm in analysis now, but he and I have had a long and fruitful, done long and fruitful work with each other, and I never set as my goal to deal with my weight in therapy, because but I needed to look at what it was about for me. So to that degree, yes, that's true. It's one thing when it's the initiative to deal with it comes from the patient. It's another when it comes out of the bias of the therapist.
Sure.
And so when it was my initiative, it was far more fruitful work than when somebody was telling me, don't you think you could lose a few pounds?
Yeah.
Which fortunately over time, I began to get angry about.
Yeah. I wrote a couple of words down here to trigger my memory.
Sure.
And they're not working for me. Maybe they'll bring something up for you. You told a Jungian dream story. Was it one of your dreams and the Jungian was reacting to it?
No, it was my first analyst she had a dream when she was in analysis, and her analyst was fat. And in her dream, Jung says to her analyst, every extra ounce costs a pound of consciousness. And she said to me, her analyst was so grateful for that dream and thanked her. And so she wanted to share it with me. And I was not grateful. Not
so
at
in other
all.
words, the analyst had a dream about Jung and Jung said this?
No, my analyst had a dream about her analyst and Jung, because her analyst was fat.
Huh.
So, it was convoluted.
Yeah.
I was not grateful. And as I thought about it, I thought, because she's very thin. And I thought, well, I must have vanishing consciousness because I have these extra pounds. Every extra ounce costs a pound of consciousness.
Yeah,
And he
really.
must be supremely conscious.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it was infuriating because it was nonsense.
Now, another one was a story told by Erwin Yalom, who is who's written about psychotherapy and is
Yes.
held in high esteem for that
Mm-hmm.
writing. In fact, I interviewed him some years ago,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but there was a story that he wrote that you reacted very strongly.
About Betty, yes. And it's a story, I mean, it's interesting. It was a piece that was being taught in some programs because it was seen that he, in owning his prejudice, that how brave that was. But he had a fat patient whose name was Betty, and he's repulsed by her from the beginning. And he goes on at some length about it. It's a long piece, and at the end, when she dutifully loses 100 pounds because she was a good patient and made him happy. He felt the treatment was successful. And as they're parting, she points out to him that he doesn't make eye contact with her, and never shook her hand. And he then recognizes, his bias. Well, it was there from the beginning, and his bias, I submit, affected the entire treatment because unconsciously he's communicating that. She had to have known that.
Yeah,
And
there
it
must she
it was
must have.
only when some fat activist
Yeah,
started to talk about that I think it got anything other than positive attention.
yeah. It's interesting that she springs that at the end of the
Right, because she
therapy, which would indicate that there was a level of trust that was never.
was never there. And
Yeah,
I think it's, when we're in therapy, um, you always you wonder, how does my therapist view me? Does my if those things that I despise about myself, does my therapist despise that also? And with weight, it's not necessarily simply a transference issue. It's that your therapist may very well see your kind of body as repulsive. I mean, Yalom says that. um, I have my copy of the book. I can look.
no,
But
that's okay.
he says about how,
You've got it.
you know that she's offensive to him. She
Yeah,
offends him. What that why what sort of almost what right has she to look like that? Because it upsets me.
yeah. Well, he's clearly under the sway of the cultural complex that
Right.
you've been talking about.
And so his countertransference toward her, which doesn't get looked at, doesn't get explored until the very, very end, and then isn't really explored. Of course, I'm willing to bet she gained weight, gained it back. And what was the effect on her of that?
Yeah,
Of that whole experience. It's terrible, and it's commonplace. I mean, I enjoy reading him also, except for that piece.
right.
Um, but it's not unusual.
Yes. Also, you speak about the theory that I think many therapists probably hold, that fat is armor,
Uh-huh.
kind of protecting against the
Sure.
assaults of the world.
And of course, in some ways, it does function that way.
Mhm.
Um, it's in the long section in the book that I have, where I argue with Marion Woodman,
Yeah, I was going to go to that
which was
next.
fun.
Yeah,
Um, it's she has it as a pretty much a purely psychological issue. You get fat, and that's still very much true. And a lot of people think that it has its origins in a trauma, and once you work your way through the trauma, somehow presto changeo, you lose the weight and find true love and happiness. Um, but it's much more complicated than that, because in order to be fat, you first have to have the come with a body that knows how to do that. Just like, all cars don't get the same mileage from a gallon of gasoline. And we accept that. All bodies don't get the same mileage from calories. Some of us are thriftier than others. Famine comes. Some of us are going to last longer than
Yeah. You've always got that.
Yes. And there's a site called the Downey Obesity Report, and periodically he updates his post on how many causes for obesity have been reported in the literature. Last time I looked, it was over 100 different causes. So clearly, it's not a simple cause and effect relationship between emotional issues and your weight. That said, it's also true that that being fat has can be armor. It can be all kinds of things as well. So where I differ from Marion Woodwin, where I see them it's not a cause and effect relationship, but that they travel together. The psychological issues can travel with weight, just as it's like I can't remember who long ago. It's like what organ system certain issues get expressed through, and so. If you're fat or you have a tendency to be fat, then your emotional issues can play out through that. And certainly fat becomes a handy hook to hang any problem you have in your life. No, it's not. I've worked with women again and again who are fat and who will say, well, there's nobody out there for me because I'm fat, so I'll never find anybody. And I always wonder, how come I have a husband?
Yeah.
It's obvious. There are other things going on besides weight, but it's a handy hook to hang things on.
Yeah. In your own practice as a Jungian therapist, are you seeing mostly fat women or exclusively fat women?
No. That would be fine if I were, but no, I haven't specialized like that. I've never met a woman who didn't have concerns about her weight one way or the other.
Yeah.
I have had people in my practice who were fat. Actually, I had more anorexic patients over my course of my career than I have had fat ones, which always interested me because I was their nightmare.
Yeah.
They were sitting across from their nightmare. And I had to deal with my own anxiety about being judged by my weight in order to bring that up, and and to be able to say, how is it for you sitting here with me, with a body that you're terrified of having?
You raised that. Yeah.
It took a while to get there because I had to deal with my own fears.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you of what advice you have for therapists who either Jungian or not Jungian. It sounds like there are various minefields that they might stumble into. What's your? I don't know if there is a generalized advice that you could give.
Well, you could start with where you're meeting people. You need to have chairs that people can sit in without being afraid. Your favorite chair may, what do you do if you have a patient comes who's too wide for those chairs? Doesn't happen commonly, but it does happen. And to check yourself for your beliefs and biases about weight, to acquaint yourself with what people are up against, and then don't let your patient decide what he or she wants to work on. Don't decide because somebody is fat that's the issue that they want to deal with. That just, if I go to a doctor, it's the same in any healthcare profession. If I go see the doctor, it's not uncommon for doctors to tell you first to lose weight, even though you came for symptoms of something entirely different. So, and psychotherapists do that as well. If I come in and say, I'm really upset about my marriage and I don't know what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. The next thing is not, well, you could think about losing some weight. That doesn't address where they are. we are supposed to meet our patients where they are. And if you're deciding they should be different, then it's your agenda you're asserting, not theirs.
Yeah, yeah. You even note that the American Psychological Association is complicit in some
Absolutely.
ways
Yep.
in viewing fat as a pathology that can be corrected by behavior change therapy. That was in some APA document?
Yep. There was a call for, I think it came out of the CDC or NIH or something, for guidelines on how to, stem the tide of obesity. And the APA, seeing an opportunity for psychologists to get into the mix, had a panel that came up with the recommendations. And of course, it's cognitive behavioral, but there's no evidence to show that it makes any difference at all.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the long term, it's only short term. It's easy to lose weight. It's hard to keep it off.
Yeah.
So I loved Anne Lamott had a blog, a post on Facebook a year or so ago, and she said there was the time she went to see her therapist and said, I'm going to go on a diet. And her therapist said, how much weight do you plan to gain?
That's a good one.
Which is a good response. It's like,
yeah. Wow. And you mentioned the fat activism. Tell us a bit about fat activism, the pluses and the minuses of that.
Well, there are the minuses of identity politics are just as much present in fat activism as anything else. But the fat community, fat acceptance community, which is the more important part of it, is dispersed. Unlike the gay community or the Black community, there is no physical place where fat. It's like, we don't have a beach where the fat people go in the summer. It's not there. So, but the internet has, in fact, allowed to develop a de facto fat acceptance community with blogs and all kinds of things going on, so that you can begin to connect to other people who have wrestled with the issues that, if you're fat, that you've wrestled with, that where you can read and interact with other fat people and begin to get that as a sense of community around that. There are blogs, fat fashion blogs, which is important. It's like, I need to, how am I going to know where to find clothing that I might like if I can't find them in magazines and things like that. So that's a very important part, and I think has fueled what pushback there is against this dominant narrative about fat and obesity.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts to have some effect. Southwest Airlines modified their policy about flying after Kevin Smith got kicked off their flight 7 years ago now for being too fat to fly.
Flying fat.
Yeah, flying while fat is very hazardous.
Yeah.
There are a couple of podcasts as well. So it's and there are books like mine. There are several others being written by fat people talking about fat, because the only place you're going to learn about what the fat experience is to hear it from fat people, because thin people can't tell you.
Yeah. Well, we're at the place where we should wind down, and I wonder if there are any last closing thoughts that you'd like to leave our listeners with.
I hope that people who are not fat decide to explore this further, will do that and learn more about a world that they know really nothing about, and that as we bring these things out into the open and can talk about them, there's nothing I like more than to be able to talk about this sort of thing, that we can slowly, ever so slowly, begin to change. And I see it now when people online anyway, and it's starting to seep into life offline. People getting called out for doing fat shaming, for, you know, finally you can see there are like a few fat actresses, so you can begin to see a fat woman who has a life being shown on television, not so much in the movies, but some. And that's important, because the more you see us, the more you can lose your fear of us. It's the
You know,
same.
synchronistically, I just heard Terry Gross on Fresh Air interviewing, I'm not going to pronounce her name correctly, the woman who played in the film Precious.
Yes, Gabra Sidibe.
Yeah, and she's just written an autobiographical book.
Right.
And what a marvelous person she is, and what a great example of potentially, I think, of somebody who's really.
If you want to see how vicious people can be toward fat people, if you go back to when Precious came out and read the review in the New York Times about how she was described. We also have now the most popular series on television this last year was This Is Us, which has a fat character.
Yeah, I love that.
And she's beautiful. And she was picked as one of People Magazine's 50 most beautiful women. Delightful.
So it can change.
Yes.
There's
yeah.
hope.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's hope. Hey, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Great. So just to say your name again, Dr. Cheryl Fuller, thanks for being my guest today on Shrink Rap Radio.
Thank you very much for having me.